Using Prisma with a Dockerized MongoDB should be easy, right? Unfortunately, you'd be wrong, but in this video, I'm going to make it easy for you. Now, in order to get this done, we're going to run into kind of three main issues or three main nuances in how to get this whole setup running. And I'm going to take you through each of those. And then at the end of the video, I'll tell you a little bit about why I prefer this setup to the recommended setup by Prisma. The first thing we're going to do is do our standard Prisma setup. So we're going to do say npm install Prisma and npm install dev dependencies Prisma client. Now I'm using, this is in the context of a monorepo. I'm using pnpm. There's going to be a couple things that we'll do a little bit differently because of that, but really this should all be very similar to a standard setup. So with Prisma installed, we will make sure to Prisma init, and this will set up our standard Prisma files. It'll also set up an env file that we'll take a look at. So let's go take a look at our .env file. So by default, Prisma sets us up for Postgres, which is nice, but in our schema file, we want to make sure we're using MongoDB. So we'll put in MongoDB as the provider, and then because I'm in a monorepo, one other thing that I have to do is I have to set an output directory because I want Prisma's generated client to be only in this workspace. So we're going to say node module /prisma/client to make sure that's a little bit more localized. Another thing I like to do is validate each step as I implement it. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to say npx prisma generate, which will attempt to generate the client. Because we don't have any models in here yet, though, Prisma is going to complain at us a little bit and say, you don't have any models. You can define a model like this. So let's just follow their instructions here. We're going to add a user model, which is going to be in compliance with a MongoDB setup here. So we did that after we changed the provider. We ran the generate, gives us this little code. And if we just run that generate command again, it should say everything is good. Yep. And one little nuance here, again, because I'm in this monorepo setup, the import looks a little bit different here. You can just ignore that on my machine, use whatever's showing up on your machine. All right, and here's our first little nuance here. Prisma uses transactions, and in MongoDB, those are only supported when you're using a replica set. So what we're going to have to do is set up a MongoDB replica set with a single running instance of Mongo, a single Docker container. Everything has like a node of one, right? Thankfully, Prisma didn't leave us alone in this. And so we can go out, we can go out to Prisma's GitHub, and they have a Dockerfile under their GitHub, both MongoDB replica in here. So they've given us a basic setup of a Docker image that spins up a Mongo replica set 1. So we're going to copy that. We're just going to reuse it in our environment, same exact way they do. So to do this, we're going to make a directory called MongoDB rs for replica set. And then in there, we will create a Docker file. And we'll go ahead and just open that up in VS Code and paste in the Docker file contents from the Prisma GitHub. And let's just take a minute to quickly go through this so we kind of understand what's happening. So we start from the base Mongo image. We're going to override the entry point and specify a custom MongoD command for startup. We're specifying a few environment variables here, like the Mongo replica port, like down below, we've got the username, password getting used. Okay, so basically what this is doing is we're going to overwrite it. We're going to capture the PID. Then we're going to make a couple of custom calls. So down here it says Mongo admin. So we're running a few commands as admin. The commands are repl command, which is a replica set command, and user command, set up a user. So that's replica.initiate, replica set.initiate, tells Mongo to run as a replica set. We set up a default user to be the root user. And then we basically reattach that Mongo PID to the root running process of the container so that everything can shut down cleanly. So now let's go ahead and build that container, set it up. We're going to use Docker Compose for that, of course. So we're going to touch Docker Compose.yaml. And in there, we paste in just a basic Docker Compose setup here. I'll make sure we want to build that image. I named it MongoDB, not Mongo RS. And we just make sure to set up all these environment variables, the username, password, initial database, localhost port. So let's run docker compose up dash D. And we'll say docker compose logs follow, see the output. And we can see that it worked. Everything replica set online. Great. Again, for the sake of validation, let's make sure that we can see our database in there and that like the auth credentials work. So we can say docker compose exec mongo. So in the current running Mongo container, we're going to execute a command and it's going to enter into the Mongo shell. So we're going to say user is Mongo, password is, I think example it was. Cool. So we can see here that the command prompt inside of Mongo is saying rs0, replica set 0, primary. If I say show DBs, I do see the standard Mongo databases, admin config and local. And you'll notice that our default Mongo database isn't in there yet. One little nuance here is that Mongo will not create a database until a collection for that database has been created. So let's leave this terminal open and we'll go ahead and create another one. And we're going to make sure that we're in the right directory. So I have the Prisma schema set up, and I want to be able to push this collection into my Mongo database. But this is kind of the second nuance that I always run into when I'm running with Mongo, is the URL strings. So if we go look at our .env file for Prisma, it's still set up for Postgres. So let's set this up for the connection to our Mongo database. So it's going to be MongoDB. Username is Mongo, password is example, connection port is 27017. The database is Mongo. These are some query string parameters for Postgres, so we'll get rid of those. This is what I always want to write. This is wrong. Yes, we want to connect to the Mongo database, but the users that Mongo is going to authenticate with are in the admin database. So in order to do that, in order to make sure that we're connecting and validating against the admin database, we have to say auth source is admin. Can't tell you how many times I spin my wheels for getting that little query string parameter. So with that in place, we should be able to say npx prisma, oh boy, fingers are in the wrong place, prisma db push, and it should successfully connect and push in our user schema, which should result in a user collection. Looks like that worked, but let's go back to our Mongo shell and validate that we have the new database. Awesome, we do. We have Mongo. And if I use Mongo, I can say db user.count to show that that collection does in fact exist, but it's empty, of course. All right, let's hop out of here. Clear that. Now, normally I could go start seeding my data, doing some of that, but I want to jump to the third nuance with this setup. Like I said, Prisma got us started with the Dockerfile, but they're missing something. If I go and just shut down my Docker Compose setup here, if I say Docker Compose stop, there it goes, and I run it again, I just try to bring it back up again, and this time we'll do it without detaching because I just want to see the logs right away. What we'll see is an error has occurred. Okay, let's just kill it. It says, error, couldn't add user, user Mongo admin already exists. So the reason this is happening is if we go back to our Dockerfile, we see that whenever this container spins up, it's always trying to create the user. But the user already exists if you started it once, stopped it, and are restarting it again. So in order to improve the development flow here, all we have to do is add a little command in front that says db get user, checks if the user is already there. If it comes back as a null, then it will go create the user. Otherwise, it just skips the step. Now to use this, we have to make sure that we say docker compose build. Whoops. How do you spell build? How do you spell build? This will make sure that we pick up our changes from the Dockerfile. Then if I docker compose up again, docker compose logs -f2 follow, we don't see that error occurring anymore. And if we scroll up, we do see this success message, replica set online. Well, there you go. You guys are all set up with Prisma, Mongo, and Docker. Now, when going through the Prisma docs, they're going to recommend that you use Mongo Atlas, which is the cloud offering of MongoDB. But there are three main reasons why I don't really prefer this setup. The first reason is that I don't like to have to register an account to anybody in order to play with their technology. And that's what you have to do with MongoDB Atlas. Number two, I really prefer to have my stuff locally so I can work offline. I feel like I can connect my tools better and have more control over data seeding and stuff like that when I'm doing things locally. And the main reason number three, is probably that once I set this all up in Docker Compose and I've got my app in there, my database, maybe a Redis, I can put all that into my CI system. I can push it on every commit. I can have it running through end-to-end tests. Everything is ephemeral. All the data seeding is controlled. There's no extra environment setup that I have to do, no extra cloud costs, anything like that. So I really prefer to do everything in a controlled Docker environments like this. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.